Howdy, this is Lemmy with RevZilla. I'm here in Daytona Beach, Florida for the launch of the new Victory Octane. Now this is our first look at this motorcycle and I'm pretty excited about it. Victory's got this set up so we really are attacking this bike two different ways. Today we've got this on a closed course so we can really explore the outer limits of the Octane's performance. Tomorrow, however, we're going to take this thing out into the street so we can get it in its natural environment and sort of figure out how this is going to perform for most riders who are going to be riding this on the street. I'm pretty excited to get my hands on this motorcycle. Victory's made some big promises for it.
Okay, so I've just had my first few miles on the Octane, and this is a really fun bike to ride. I'm having a good time on it so far. I feel like it may even be geared a little differently than the Scout was. And I say that simply because it just seems to get off the line in a big, fast hurry. We do have 4 more horsepower from the mill, 4 more foot-pounds of torque, so that's not hurting matters either. The only thing I guess I get a little confused with is when Victory was pushing this, you know, they're calling this a muscle bike, and I'll be honest, when I think of a muscle bike, I think of a much longer bike that sort of has a nod towards like a drag bike. This bike is actually not that bike to me. But the interesting part though is I think I actually like this bike better. It's a better balanced motorcycle. We haven't killed it on the curves here in Florida. Florida, it turns out, has some pretty straight roads. But the ones we have gotten through, this bike is very, very manageable. I actually really like the way it's dropped into a couple of the corners I've hit so far. So I'm gonna put a couple more miles on here and let me see if I can get a little better acquainted with this motorcycle.
Alrighty, we're at the tail end of day one. I'm hot, I'm dirty, I'm sweaty, and my hair is an absolute mess. But I had a blast out there. Now, if you guys are anything like I am, you were reading the internet and you were trying to find out exactly what I was trying to find out. Is the Victory Octane just a warmed over Scout or is this something new? The answer is kind of a mixed bag. Let's start with the drivetrain on here. This motor is noticeably more peppy than the one found in the Scout. This is sort of like an Indian Scout on crack. It really was a fun time. There's lots of mid-range here that I think the Scout lacked. You should be aware that there's some other pieces of the bike that were also kind of Scout-like, and that's not a compliment. Let's talk about the front brake. When we reviewed the Scout, I thought the single disc front brake was actually very good for being a single disc. It handles a 100 horsepower bike pretty nicely. However, with all the mid-range that the Octane offers, I feel like I ride it differently, and I really would have done better with a twin disc up front. One of the other things too that was also kind of Scout-like and not necessarily in a great way was the tires. Now you guys saw all that tire smoke I was kicking up. It was a lot of fun. The only problem is tire smoke represents a lack of traction, and that means you're burning horsepower. If you're not sticking to the ground, you're not going fast. You want your tires to transfer the power right to the ground rather than sliding all over the place. These are bias ply tires. I really would have liked to have seen a radial, sporty tire on here that could actually stick to the pavement some. Now, one of the other things too I had to keep reminding myself of as I was testing this bike was that this test unit is actually not equipped like a stock motorcycle is. Victory threw some other bits and pieces on here to sort of sweeten the deal up a little bit. There's an analog tack, which I found super useful. I wasn't really a big fan of the Indian Scout's digital. This bike's equipped with both a digital and an analog tack. I also had these piggyback shocks here that I had talked about. Piggyback shocks are great on this bike. They represent a real improvement to the suspension. Those lay-down units on the Indian Scout weren't so hot. Rounding things out, you can see the mufflers on here too. This is another Victory edition. I really liked all of these parts, but those components weren't included in the base price of the bike. So if you're considering an Octane, just remember, bumping up to those pieces may hit you in the wallet just a little bit. Okay, I gotta get showered up and get ready for a day 2 where we're gonna take this out on the street and give it a little bit more realistic day-to-day type of testing.
Now, in spending a little time with the Octane on the street, I was able to assess this a little bit more normally in the type of conditions most people are going to be riding in. The first thing that impressed me, just like on track day, I love the way power is delivered from the Octane. This puppy is awesome. Now, there are going to be some naysayers out there who say this isn't a true muscle bike, it doesn't make enough horsepower. And that's probably true. It does spot some horsepower to competitors like the V-Rod or the Diavel especially. However, it's also much cheaper than those bikes, and it's also a little bit shorter, so it handles better too. Think of it as a 3/4 version of just about everything. Now, this engine really is making gobs and gobs of torque. There's some naysayers out there who will compare this to the Scout, and they're going to say something to the effect of, hey, only 4 more foot-pounds of torque, only 4 more horsepower. It's a carbon copy, and it couldn't be further from the truth. There's different cams in the Octane. Turns this bike into a whole different monster. When we tested the Scout, I remember thinking about the duality of that motor. It was a Jekyll and Hyde. It was very docile when you were, down low in the RPM range, but once you started revving that baby out, man, it hauled the mail. The Octane is different than that. It hauls the mail all over the rev range. There's instant torque on tap. From about 2,500 right up to the red line, this baby takes off like a rocket. I love the powertrain on this motorcycle. The cams and the different gearing really help exemplify how different the engine actually is. Now let's move on to braking. Braking on the Octane, I don't want to talk too long about because it looks like the brakes were taken right off of the Scout. I remember being impressed on the Scout with how the single brake setup worked. It was pretty good for what it was, but it still wasn't a dual disc setup. It's a little bit more apparent here on the Octane because this is a more aggressive motorcycle. There were several times I was left wanting a little bit more brake on this bike. Now let's talk about the suspension and the handling of this bike. This is different than the Scout. I can really get down and start getting squirrely with this motorcycle. Putting a foot peg on the floor isn't difficult at all. Handling is much improved over a bike like the Scout and definitely over other muscle bikes that this may be competing against. The handling on here really is good. Now when it comes to suspension, we talked about the rear end on this baby having those aftermarket shocks, but the front end feels like it was taken right off the Scout as well. And that's not necessarily a good thing. I'm a big boy at 275, but I have a feeling even if we take a rider who's 100 pounds lighter than I am and put him on this motorcycle, they're going to say the same thing I did. Undersprung and underdamped. The front suspension needs a little bit of work. So the other thing to think about too that also contributes to the handling, that different size wheel up there, as well as the different swing arm setup on this bike, all leading to a bike that handles a little bit better. Here, check out over here on my right side. I've got quite a bit of rash on my foot peg and also on my exhaust shield when I got a little bit aggressive in the corners. Ultimately, I'm really glad I got to spend some time on the Octane. This thing's a boatload of fun, but it is time for me to give this bike back. So as always, I'm Lemmy, and I'm out of here.